What if I told you that a group of scientists once launched an experiment so dangerous, so unpredictable, that there was a real chance it could ignite the Earth's atmosphere and end all life in a matter of seconds? This wasn't a science fiction movie. It wasn't a thought experiment. It was real, highly classified, deeply controversial, and hidden behind layers of secrecy. This test almost slipped past history books, but its consequences could have echoed for eternity. In the name of progress, we flirted with extinction, and the scariest part, the people behind it knew the risks, and they did it anyway. If you're into mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe. We reveal the stories no one ever told you. It was the height of the Cold War, a time when the world's greatest powers were locked in a silent, escalating race, not for medals or glory, but for the ability to end civilization with the push of a button. The fear of nuclear annihilation was everywhere. Schools ran duck-and-cover drills, governments built fallout shelters, and in secret laboratories scientists worked day and night, driven by the terrifying logic of mutually assured destruction. But behind the visible arms race, a more sinister layer existed, projects so secretive that even presidents weren't always fully informed. Experiments that pushed the boundaries of physics and sanity. One of the first dominoes to fall was the Manhattan Project. In 1945, when the US tested the first atomic bomb in the desert of New Mexico, even the project's own lead physicists admitted they weren't 100% sure it wouldn't ignite the atmosphere. Nobel Prize-winning physicist Edward Teller raised the concern himself. Could the explosion trigger a chain reaction that burns the entire planet? They ran the numbers. They decided the chances were low. And then they lit the fuse. The bomb didn't end the world, but it opened the door to something much darker. The success of that test gave birth to an idea. If we could split the atom, what else could we do? By the 1950s, both the US and the Soviet Union were conducting more than just weapons tests. They began experimenting with the environment itself, the sky, the Earth's magnetosphere, even the ionosphere. This wasn't just about building bigger bombs. It was about playing with the rules of nature. Enter Project Starfish Prime, a name that sounds innocent, even poetic, but the reality behind it was chilling. In 1962, the United States detonated a thermonuclear warhead 400 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean, just to see what would happen to the Earth's magnetic field. The explosion was visible from over 1,000 miles away. It knocked out communications across Hawaii. It disabled satellites in orbit. It painted the night sky with unnatural auroras that glowed red and green, like a scene from an alien invasion. But most disturbing of all, some scientists believed this test could create a runaway effect, that it might destroy the Van Allen radiation belts protecting Earth from solar radiation, or worse, create a permanent electromagnetic storm that could render the planet uninhabitable. And yet, they pressed the button. This was not the only test. The Soviet Union responded with its own series of high-altitude nuclear experiments. In their remote Arctic testing grounds, places like Novaya Zemlya became the setting for explosions so massive they shattered ice shelves and sent shockwaves around the planet. Meanwhile, back in the US, another idea took root, using nuclear explosions not for war but for construction. Sounds crazy? It was. The Plowshare program was launched to explore peaceful uses of nukes, digging harbors, blasting mountain passes, even creating new oil fields. The logic was always the same. If we don't do it first, they will. What no one seemed to ask was, should we do it at all? July 9th, 1962, a date that should be far more infamous than it is. At precisely 11 p.m. UTC, a US military rocket launched from Johnston Island in the Pacific Ocean. At its tip, a 1.4 megaton thermonuclear warhead. The mission, Starfish Prime, one of the boldest, most reckless scientific experiments in human history. The bomb exploded at an altitude of 400 kilometers above most of Earth's atmosphere. The fireball was immense, stretching across space itself. But what followed was even more shocking. Within seconds, streetlights in Hawaii, nearly 2,500 kilometers away, shorted out. Radio signals across the Pacific were disrupted. 6 U.S. satellites, one-third of the nation's entire orbital fleet at the time, were instantly disabled. The sky glowed with unnatural colors, drawing fearful eyes upward from thousands of miles around. And still, no one outside a tiny circle of insiders knew what was truly at stake. Some physicists had warned detonating a nuclear device at that altitude might create a new radiation belt around the Earth. Others feared that if the Van Allen belts, Earth's natural protective shield, were destabilized, it could open the planet to deadly cosmic radiation. One memo even speculated, a chance, however remote, of atmospheric ignition cannot be completely dismissed, and yet the test was greenlit. Why? Because Cold War logic didn't work on safety or ethics. It worked on fear. If the Soviets were working on high-altitude weapons, the US had to beat them to the punch. Detonating a bomb in space wasn't madness. It was considered necessary. And the US wasn't alone. Just 1 year earlier, on October 30th, 1961, the Soviet Union had conducted the largest man-made explosion in history, the Tsar Bomba. A 50-megaton hydrogen bomb detonated over Novaya Zemlya, a remote archipelago in the Arctic Circle. The fireball was 8 kilometers wide. Windows shattered 900 kilometers away. The mushroom cloud rose over 60 kilometers high, almost to the edge of space. If detonated at ground level, the Tsar Bomba would have carved a crater 100 times deeper than the Grand Canyon. Thankfully, they set it off mid-air, allegedly as an act of restraint. But why build such a bomb? Soviet physicists knew it was too large to be a practical weapon. It couldn't even fit on a standard missile. Its only purpose was psychological, to demonstrate that they could end humanity any time. Meanwhile, in the US, the Plowshare program pushed the boundaries of absurdity. One proposed plan involved using nuclear explosions to dig a new canal through Central America. Another, codenamed Project Chariot, aimed to blast a deep-water port into the Alaskan coast using multiple warheads. And perhaps the most surreal, Project A119, a top-secret plan proposed by none other than Edward Teller and backed by a young Carl Sagan. The goal? Detonate a nuclear bomb on the moon, just to show the Soviets that America had space superiority. The test would have been visible from Earth, a lunar firework to intimidate the world. Thankfully, it never happened. But the very fact it was seriously considered shows just how far obsession had overtaken reason. And yet, amid these grand and terrifying visions, something far simpler nearly ended everything, a misunderstanding. On September 26, 1983, a Soviet early warning system reported multiple incoming US nuclear missiles. The man in charge, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, had just minutes to respond. The protocol was clear: report the launch, initiate retaliation. But Petrov hesitated. Something didn't feel right. He disobeyed orders. He reported it as a false alarm. And he was right. The system had malfunctioned. Had he followed procedure, it would have triggered an all-out nuclear exchange. One man, one decision. That's how close we came to extinction. Even nature began reacting to these tests. After decades of atmospheric detonations, radioactive isotopes began to show up in rainwater, milk, even in children's teeth. A study called the Baby Tooth Survey, conducted in the US during the 1950s and 60s, revealed that strontium-90, a dangerous radioactive element, had entered the food chain. Kids born after nuclear testing began had up to 50 times more radiation in their bones than those born before. Entire islands became uninhabitable. In places like Bikini Atoll and the Marshall Islands, indigenous populations were forcibly relocated. Decades later, those who returned still suffer high cancer rates and birth defects. Some islands remain radioactive to this day. ghostly reminders of what testing really means. And through it all, secrecy reigned. Many of the most dangerous tests were never made public until decades later. Declassified documents show that both US and Soviet scientists regularly debated the risks of planetary damage, but their concerns were often buried beneath military urgency. They asked questions like, could a nuclear explosion trigger an unstoppable chain reaction in the ocean? Would an underground test create earthquakes that might ripple across continents? Could radiation from high-altitude detonations linger for centuries? Sometimes the answers were, we don't know, and still, the countdown continued. By the way, if stories like this fascinate you as much as they fascinate us, hit the like button and drop a comment below. What part of this story shocked you the most? We often think of near apocalypses as the stuff of Hollywood. Meteor strikes, alien invasions, rogue AI, but the truth is far more disturbing, because we came closest to ending the world not by accident, but by deliberate design. The legacy of these experiments is written not just in history books, but in contaminated soil, broken lives, and political scars that never healed. The high-altitude nuclear tests like Starfish Prime did more than knock out a few satellites. They permanently altered Earth's radiation belts. The artificial radiation created by that single explosion lasted over 5 years, degrading satellite electronics and affecting spacecraft trajectories. In essence, we created an artificial hazard zone in orbit, one we still haven't fully cleaned up. The consequences went beyond technology. They reached into human DNA. Generations of people exposed to fallout began experiencing rare cancers, thyroid disorders, and genetic mutations. Indigenous populations in the Pacific and Arctic became unwitting test subjects, their suffering hidden behind military classification. And still, some of the worst consequences came from what almost happened, and didn't. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, US warships dropped depth charges on a Soviet submarine to force it to surface. The crew inside believed war had already started. The captain gave the order to launch a nuclear torpedo, something that would have triggered World War III on the spot. The only reason it didn't happen? One man, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to authorize the launch. He stood firm in that submarine, surrounded by panic, and saved the world without ever knowing it. But how many close calls can we survive? Documents declassified in the 2000s reveal that both the US and the USSR came dangerously close to detonating high-yield bombs that could have triggered global atmospheric consequences. One internal US Air Force memo even raised the possibility that underground nuclear tests might destabilize tectonic fault lines, potentially causing massive earthquakes. Even more haunting, scientists considered that igniting hydrogen in the ocean could create massive steam explosions or poison marine ecosystems. These ideas weren't the ravings of conspiracy theorists. They were discussed in actual government research facilities. And yet, despite all of this, the bombs, the fallout, the brush with extinction, we kept going. It wasn't until 1963 that the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, finally banning atmospheric and space-based detonations. But the damage had already been done. To this day, over 2,000 nuclear tests have been conducted around the world. And while the Cold War may be over, the technology and the mentality still exists. In 2020, new discussions surfaced about tactical nukes and the possibility of space-based defense systems using nuclear propulsion. Meanwhile, rogue nations continue testing and secret facilities continue researching. We stand on a knife's edge, just as we did 60 years ago. The difference is now we know what's at stake. We began this story with a simple question. What if a secret experiment nearly ended the world? Now we know it wasn't just one. It was a chain of events, fueled by fear, ego, and the relentless pursuit of power, where humanity danced on the edge of its own destruction. What's perhaps most terrifying is not that these experiments happened, but that they were approved, calculated, even celebrated. Brilliant minds, Nobel-winning scientists, military strategists, all convinced that the risk was worth it, that the apocalypse could be managed. But can it? If we came that close once, who's to say we won't again? With today's technologies, AI, biotechnology, space militarization, we face new frontiers just as dangerous and perhaps even less understood. Are we repeating the same mistakes, just under a different flag? Maybe the real question isn't whether we can control the forces we unlock, but whether we're humble enough to stop before we can't. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with us through this incredible and terrifying journey. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments what part of this story shocked you the most. Until the next mystery, stay curious and stay aware.